Mary Tudor was born in 1516. She was the daughter of King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. From the moment she was born, Mary was surrounded by wealth, power, and royalty. She was raised inside one of the most important royal courts in Europe, and for many years, she was the center of her father's world. Henry loved his daughter. Mary was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply religious. She learned languages, history, music, and the responsibilities expected from a future royal woman. For a while, Mary believed her future was secure. She was the king's daughter. She was a princess, and everyone expected her to have an important place in the future of England. But then, her father's greatest desire began to change everything. Henry wanted a son, a male heir who could inherit the throne. Mary was a daughter, and although she was the king's child, Henry began to worry that she could not provide the succession he wanted. Then Henry became deeply interested in another woman, Anne Boleyn, and was very different from Mary's mother. She was young, intelligent, ambitious, and she refused to become simply another royal mistress. Henry wanted to marry her, but there was a problem. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon. Henry asked the Pope to end his marriage, but the request was refused, and Henry became increasingly determined to get what he wanted. His decision would change Mary's life forever. Henry eventually broke with Rome. He declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and his marriage to Catherine was declared invalid. Mary was suddenly caught in the middle of a royal crisis. Her mother was no longer queen, and Mary was no longer officially recognized as a legitimate princess. The girl who had once been treated like the future of the royal family was suddenly pushed aside. Henry ordered Mary to accept that her parents' marriage had never been valid. But Mary refused. She believed her parents' marriage was legitimate, and she refused to abandon her mother. This decision came with a terrible price. Mary was separated from Catherine. The mother and daughter who had been so close could no longer live together. Mary was forbidden from seeing her mother freely, and their letters became some of the most precious things in her life. Catherine remained loyal to her daughter, and Mary remained loyal to her mother. But their situation became more dangerous every year. Anne Boleyn had become queen, and she now had a daughter of her own, Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister. The royal court was changing around her. Mary had lost her title. She had lost her position. She had lost her place in the succession. And worst of all, she had lost the security she once felt inside her own family. But Mary still refused to surrender. She was pressured to accept her father's decisions. She was pressured to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen. And she was pressured to accept that she was no longer the legitimate heir. Yet Mary continued to resist. She knew the danger. She knew her father had enormous power, and she knew that refusing him could have serious consequences. But she also believed that giving up her principles would mean losing the last part of herself. Then, the greatest tragedy came. Mary's mother Catherine of Aragon became seriously ill. Mary desperately wanted to see her, but Henry continued to keep them apart. Catherine knew that she was dying, and she worried about what would happen to her daughter after she was gone. She wrote to Mary. She encouraged her to remain strong, and she reminded her daughter never to abandon her faith. Soon, Mary lost the woman who had been her greatest source of love and strength. Catherine of Aragon died in 1536. Mary was devastated. She had lost her mother, her title, her position, and much of her father's affection. She was still alive, but the childhood she had known was gone forever. Yet Mary did not know that her greatest struggle was still ahead. Because one day, the daughter who had been pushed aside, the princess who had been declared illegitimate, would fight for the crown itself. And when that day came, England would discover just how determined Mary Tudor really was. Mary had lost her mother. She had lost her title, and she had been pushed away from the royal succession. But she was still the daughter of King Henry VIII. And somewhere inside her, there was still a belief that one day, her father might forgive her. For years, Mary lived under enormous pressure. She was watched closely. Her letters were monitored, and her relationship with her father remained uncertain. Then another tragedy changed everything. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had replaced Mary's mother, fell from power in 1536, and was accused of serious crimes. She was imprisoned, and eventually executed. Mary watched the royal court change again. But Anne's fall did not restore Mary to the position she once had. Henry had already married another woman, Jane Seymour, and Jane gave Henry exactly what he had wanted for so long: a son, Prince Edward. When Edward was born, Henry was overjoyed. The birth of a male heir changed the future of England. Mary now had a younger half-brother, and her place in the succession became even more uncertain. But Jane Seymour did something important. She tried to bring Mary and Henry back together. Mary eventually submitted to her father. She accepted his authority, and she was allowed back into royal life. But she had paid a terrible price. She had been forced to accept that she was illegitimate. She had been forced to accept her father's marriage decisions, and she had lost the freedom she once had. Still, Mary was back at court, and for the first time in years, she had hope. She became close to her younger brother Edward, and she cared deeply about him. But Henry's marriages continued. Jane Seymour died shortly after giving birth to Edward. Then Henry married again, and again. His wives came and went, but Mary remained. She was the king's daughter. She had survived political storms that had destroyed other members of the royal family, and she was learning how dangerous royal power could be. Henry eventually died in 1547. His son Edward became king. Edward was only 9 years old. Mary was now the daughter of a dead king, and the sister of the new king. But Edward was strongly Protestant. Mary was deeply Catholic. The religious divide between them became increasingly important. Mary continued practicing her faith, even when it caused political tension. She refused to abandon Catholic worship. Edward and his advisors wanted England to remain Protestant. Mary wanted to preserve the religion she believed in. Their relationship became difficult, but Mary still loved her brother. She hoped that when Edward became older, he might understand her position. But Edward became seriously ill, and suddenly, the future of England was uncertain again. Edward had no children, and the next person in the traditional line of succession was Mary. If Edward died, Mary would become queen. But there were powerful people who did not want that to happen. They feared that Mary would restore Catholicism, and they feared that England would return to the religion of her mother. Edward himself was also worried. Before his death, he supported a plan to prevent Mary from inheriting the crown. The succession was changed, and the throne was given to Lady Jane Grey. Jane was young. She was Protestant, and she was chosen because powerful men believed they could control the future through her. When Edward died in 1553, Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, but Mary refused to accept it. For the first time in her life, she had a choice. She could run, she could surrender, or she could fight. Mary chose to fight. She gathered supporters. She moved toward London, and ordinary people began to rally behind her. Mary was no longer simply a forgotten princess. She was claiming the crown, the same crown that had once seemed impossible for her to reach. Support for Jane collapsed quickly, and within days, Mary entered London as queen. Lady Jane Grey was removed from the throne. Mary had won, after a lifetime of rejection, humiliation, and uncertainty. Mary Tudor had finally become Queen of England. She was 37 years old. She had waited almost her entire life for this moment. But the crown she had fought so hard to obtain came with a terrible burden. Mary wanted to restore the religion of her mother. She wanted to reverse the changes made by her father and brother. She believed she was saving England. But many people feared what her reign would bring. The woman who had spent her youth fighting to protect her faith was now in a position to impose it on an entire country. And soon, Mary would discover that becoming queen was much easier than keeping a kingdom united. Mary had finally won the crown. After years of humiliation, after losing her mother, after being declared illegitimate, and after being pushed aside by her own family, she was now Queen Mary I of England. For the first time in her life, Mary had the power to make her own decisions. But the crown came with a dangerous problem: religion. Mary was a devoted Catholic. She believed that England had been taken away from the faith of her mother. She wanted to restore Catholicism. She wanted the old churches, the old traditions, and the authority of Rome. But England had changed. Her father Henry VIII had broken with Rome. Her brother Edward had pushed the country even further toward Protestantism. Thousands of people had grown up with the new religion, and many had no desire to return to Catholic rule. Mary believed she was restoring what had been taken away, but her opponents believed she was destroying England's new religious identity. The tension grew quickly, and then Mary faced another challenge. She needed an heir. Mary was 37 years old. For a woman of her time, that was already considered an advanced age for having children. But Mary desperately wanted a child. If she could have a son or daughter, the Tudor dynasty could continue, and the future of England would remain secure. Then, Mary met Philip of Spain. Philip was the son of the powerful Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He was wealthy, powerful, and deeply Catholic. A marriage between Mary and Philip could strengthen England's relationship with Spain. But many English people were terrified of the idea. They feared that England would become controlled by Spain. They feared foreign influence. And they feared that Mary was giving too much power to a foreign prince. Mary did not give up. She wanted Philip, and she believed their marriage would strengthen her country. In 1554, Mary and Philip were married. The wedding was grand, but the public reaction was far more complicated. Many people did not celebrate. Instead, rebellion began. One of the most serious threats came from Sir Thomas Wyatt. He led a rebellion against Mary. The rebels marched toward London, and for a moment, it seemed possible that the Queen could lose her throne. Mary responded personally. She went to the Guildhall in London and spoke to the people. She presented herself not simply as a queen, but as a woman whose people were being threatened. Her speech helped rally support. The rebellion collapsed. But Mary was now more suspicious than ever. She believed her enemies were everywhere, and the rebellion had consequences. Lady Jane Grey, the young woman who had briefly been queen, was still alive. But Mary feared that Jane could become a symbol for future rebellion. Eventually, Mary made the terrible decision to have Jane executed. Jane was only 16. Her death became one of the darkest moments of Mary's reign. Mary had won the crown, but now she was becoming associated with executions and persecution, and her reputation was beginning to change. Then something happened that seemed almost miraculous. Mary believed she was pregnant. The Queen had finally received the news she had been waiting for. She was going to have a child. The entire country waited. Mary herself believed that her greatest dream was finally coming true. She imagined a future where she would hold her own child. A Tudor heir. A child who would secure the crown. For a woman who had lost so much, this pregnancy represented hope. But the months passed, and something was wrong. There was no baby. Mary's body showed signs that made her believe she was pregnant. But eventually, it became clear that she was not. The hope disappeared. The Queen had to face the truth. She was not going to become a mother. The emotional impact was enormous. Mary had spent her entire life losing the people she loved. And now, She had lost another dream. Her marriage to Philip also became difficult. Philip spent long periods away from England, and Mary deeply missed him. She wanted his affection. She wanted his support. But the marriage did not become the happy partnership she had imagined. Mary was queen, but she was often alone. And while her personal life was falling apart, her religious policies were creating more opposition. Protestants who refused to return to Catholicism were being punished. Some were imprisoned. Some were executed. And hundreds were burned at the stake. These executions would eventually give Mary one of the darkest reputations in English history. The name Bloody Mary would remain attached to her for centuries. But the real woman behind that name was more complicated. She was a daughter who had lost her mother. A woman who had spent years fighting for her identity. A queen who desperately wanted a child. And a ruler who believed she was protecting the religion she loved. Yet history would judge her harshly. And Mary's greatest tragedy was that the crown she had fought her entire life to obtain was slowly becoming the source of her isolation. Her health began to decline. Her marriage brought little comfort. Her dream of motherhood had disappeared. And her country was becoming increasingly divided. Mary had finally become queen. But she was beginning to discover that winning the crown did not mean winning happiness. Mary had spent most of her life fighting for the crown. And now that she finally had it, she discovered that power could not give her the happiness she had always wanted. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was becoming increasingly distant. Philip often stayed away from England. And Mary missed him deeply. She wanted a family. She wanted children. And she wanted the marriage to become a source of comfort. But instead, she often found herself alone. Then Mary believed once again that she was pregnant. The news filled the palace with excitement. The queen believed that this time, her dream might finally come true. She imagined holding her child. She imagined an heir. And she imagined leaving behind a Tudor dynasty that would continue after her death. But once again, the months passed, and no child was born. Mary had suffered another false pregnancy. The disappointment was devastating. She had already lost her mother. She had lost her father. She had lost her brother. And now she was losing the hope of becoming a mother. Her health also began to deteriorate. She suffered from severe headaches, weakness, and other painful problems. Some historians believe she may have suffered from a serious illness. But the exact cause of her decline remains uncertain. Mary became increasingly withdrawn. And while she struggled privately, her political problems continued. England's relationship with Spain became more complicated. Philip wanted England to support Spanish interests. Many English people feared that the country was becoming too closely connected to Spain. Mary wanted to keep her marriage strong. But she also had to protect her kingdom. Then came another disaster. War. England went to war with France. And in 1558, England suffered a major defeat at Calais. Calais had been England's last major possession in France. And its loss was deeply humiliating. For Mary, the defeat was devastating. She had spent her reign trying to restore England's strength. But now, one of England's most important territories was gone. Her health continued to worsen. And she knew that her time was running out. Mary had no surviving child. And the next person in line to the throne was her half-sister Elizabeth. But Elizabeth was a Protestant. And Mary knew that if Elizabeth became queen, many of her religious changes could be reversed. The thought troubled her deeply. Mary and Elizabeth had never had an easy relationship. They were sisters. But they had grown up in very different worlds. Elizabeth's mother had been Anne Boleyn, the woman who had helped destroy Mary's childhood. Yet Elizabeth herself was not responsible for the decisions of her parents. Mary knew that. But their political differences were enormous. Mary had spent her life fighting to restore Catholicism. Elizabeth would eventually take England in another direction. As Mary's health failed, She became increasingly aware that she could not stop what was coming. Her crown would pass to Elizabeth. Her religious policies would be challenged. And the Tudor future she had dreamed of would end with her. Mary had fought so hard to secure her place in history. But she could not control what history would say about her. She was becoming known as Bloody Mary because of the executions carried out during her reign. Her enemies used those deaths to portray her as cruel. Her supporters believed she was defending her faith. The truth was more complicated. Mary was a deeply religious woman. She genuinely believed that her actions were protecting England from what she considered dangerous religious error. But the methods used during her reign created fear. And that fear survived long after her death. By the autumn of 1558, Mary's condition was becoming critical. She was staying at St. James's Palace. She was weak. She was exhausted. And she knew that death was approaching. The Queen, who had fought for decades, was now preparing to surrender the one thing she could never defeat: time. Mary had spent her entire life trying to prove that she belonged. She had been told that she was illegitimate. She had been removed from the succession. She had watched her father marry other women. She had lost her mother. She had lost her brother. She had struggled to become a mother herself. And finally, she had become queen. But now, she was facing the end. Mary's story was becoming a tragedy. She had won the crown, but she could not keep the people she loved. She had gained power, but she could not control her own health. She had tried to restore her faith, but her country remained divided. And she had dreamed of a child, but she would leave no heir behind. Soon, the crown would pass to Elizabeth, and England would enter one of the most famous chapters in its history. But before Elizabeth's golden age could begin, England had to say goodbye to the Queen who had fought her entire life just to be recognized. Mary Tudor, Queen Mary I, was nearing the end of her story. By the autumn of 1558, Queen Mary I was becoming seriously ill. She was only 42 years old, but her life had been filled with years of stress, loss, political conflict, and physical suffering. Mary knew that her health was failing. She also knew that she would probably die without an heir. The dream she had carried for so many years, a child who could continue the Tudor dynasty, was never going to become reality. The woman who had spent her entire life fighting for her place on the throne was now preparing to leave it. Mary's final months were filled with sadness. Her husband Philip was far away. Her relationship with Elizabeth remained complicated, and her country was divided by religion. The Queen had tried to restore Catholicism, but the future of England was already changing. Mary had hoped that her marriage to Philip would produce a child, but that dream had failed. She had even experienced what she believed were pregnancies, only to discover that no child was coming. The disappointment had been devastating. Now there was nothing left to hope for, except perhaps peace. Mary spent her final days at St. James's Palace. She became weaker. She spent more time resting. And those around her understood that the end was near. One of the most important questions was now: who would become queen? The answer was Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman whose rise had destroyed Mary's childhood. Yet Elizabeth was now the heir. Mary could not change that. The crown that Mary had fought so hard to obtain would soon pass to the woman she had once feared. On November 17, 1558, Queen Mary died. She was 42 years old. Her reign had lasted only 5 years. But those 5 years had changed England. Mary had been the first woman to rule England in her own right, and she had fought fiercely to defend what she believed was right. Her reign was filled with controversy. She restored Catholic worship. She faced rebellions. She went to war. She lost Calais. And hundreds of Protestants were executed during her religious persecutions. Because of those executions, history gave her a terrible nickname: Bloody Mary. But Mary was more than that name. She was a daughter. A woman who had watched her family break apart. She was a believer who refused to abandon her religion. She was a wife who wanted a loving marriage. She was a woman who desperately wanted to become a mother. And she was a queen who spent her entire life trying to prove that she belonged. Her greatest tragedy may have been that, by the time she finally received the crown, she had already lost so much. Her mother was gone. Her father was gone. Her brother was gone. Her marriage had not given her the family she wanted, and she left no child behind. When Elizabeth became queen, the Tudor dynasty entered its final great chapter. Elizabeth would rule for decades. She would become one of the most famous monarchs in English history, and England would experience a very different religious and political future. But Mary would remain part of that story, because without Mary's struggle, Elizabeth's path to the throne would have looked very different. Mary Tudor had spent her entire life being told that she was not enough, not legitimate enough, not powerful enough, not important enough. But eventually, she proved everyone wrong. She became queen. She wore the crown. And she ruled England. But the crown did not give her the happiness she had spent her life searching for. It could not bring her mother back. It could not give her the child she wanted. It could not heal her broken relationships. And it could not stop her illness. Mary won the crown. But she lost almost everything else. Her story reminds us that history is rarely as simple as a nickname. Behind the name Bloody Mary, there was a woman who had suffered, a woman who had waited, a woman who had fought, and a woman who wanted nothing more than to secure the future of the family she had already lost. Queen Mary I died without an heir, but her story did not disappear. It became one of the most complicated chapters in Tudor history, a story of faith, power, family, loss, and ambition. She spent her whole life fighting to become queen, and when she finally became one, she discovered the painful truth. The crown can give you power, but it cannot give you back the people you have lost. Visit Sleepless Historian for more historical stories and royal history. Good night.